Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a Friday read. There were a couple of books that I was reading near the end of November that I haven't talked about yet, one of which was Lee Maracle's My Conversations with Canadians, which is the writer Lee Maracle talking about conversations that she's had about settler and Indigenous conversations in a Canadian context from the 60s to the current day. Her angle is quite powerful because it looks at the construction of First Nations and makes the point that if a nation has self-determination, it wouldn't have all the restrictions that the Canadian federal government has on the nations of the First Nations. The federal government determines who has status, and status being essentially citizenship. If the First Nations had self-determination, you could decide who has status. And that's a big deal because there are a lot of situations where, for example, if a woman marries a non-status man, her children don't have status, but if a man marries a non-status woman, they do. So there's a lot of discussion of when people say First Nations, it sounds good, it sounds as though you're acknowledging nationhood, but without the rights of nationhood, it's just lip service, essentially. She also talks about the changing the demographics of the literary world within Canada. She talks about going to readings, for example, in the 70s, where she would be the only woman in the room and the only Indigenous person, and how that changed slowly, but often she's the only one of those two identities even now. And there's also discussion of the way information that under normal circumstances would have been transmitted between generations was halted and then has to be paid for later. One of the points that she makes is that because so many generations were sent to residential school, they were not able to learn the skills or the information that a couple of generations ahead of them would have had, but non-Indigenous anthropologists went and talked to those grandparents, great-grandparents, whichever, and may have written down or even patented things that they found out, which means that then the younger generations of Indigenous people who were basically cut off from the original information have to go to these anthropologists or business people who are then selling it when they should have had the right to the information to begin with. And I think both that and the nationhood element are things that I haven't read a lot of elsewhere, so I thought that was quite powerful. If I had an issue with this book, it was that a few times she presents a little bit of information that is really, that's just not true, and it's not necessarily anything that's core to the argument. There's one point where she talks about trigonometry being European mathematics, and I just thought, well, the father of trigonometry was Persian, and most of the complex mathematics that she's brushing off as European mathematics are actually West Asian or Middle Eastern. So the whole idea of European mathematics it's incorrect, and I understand the point that she's making about Indigenous versus settler, but the label European is incorrect because if she just said settler, it would have made more sense. And similarly, there's another point where she's talking about the way gender roles are impacted by language, and I mean, I certainly agree that language impacts the way you see the world, but her presentation of how those interact is just not true in a global context. She makes the comment that like non-Indigenous Canadians should learn an Indigenous language because Indigenous languages don't have, for example, the heavy gendering that settler languages like French, Spanish, Portuguese have, or the gendered pronouns that English has. And the issue with that is, one, it's not universally true of Indigenous languages. Mohawk has gendered pronouns. And it's not true globally. The majority of human languages actually don't have gendered pronouns, and it has nothing to do with whether those countries are less patriarchal or whether they're less imperialistic. I mean, Hungarian, Turkish, Mongolian, they don't have gendered pronouns. It's very common for languages not to have gendered pronouns, and to present it as an Indigenous versus settler thing is just not accurate. And it's not accurate regarding imperialism or sexism in any given society. I thought those were kind of weaknesses, but still overall the book itself is having a lot of conversations that you don't necessarily see every day in regard to settler Indigenous conversations. Another book that I started in November and haven't talked about yet was Reza Aslan's No God But God, The Evolution and Future of Islam, which I had expected to have a lot more information about pre-Islamic Arabia, and it doesn't. It may be the first 15 pages or that. The rest of it is essentially a history of basically covering the time frame of the first 4 caliphs of Mecca, and then kind of a Q&A of frequently asked questions in the back of the glossary. It is very basic and very simple, I think it's primarily aimed at an American audience who, I said this in, when I did that 1K Q&A, I answered a question about the differences in US and Canadian culture, and when I was living in the US, I found a lot of people know nothing about Islam, and I think this book is trying to give a kind of 101. I do think the author has some slight biases that come through, but it's so basic that there isn't really room for a lot of that. Like in the glossary, there were a few terms that had a very practical definition when I think there's a lot more discussion and multiple definitions of things. But I think for the starter kit that I guess this is meant to be, I think it was fine. It wasn't what I was looking for, but I mean, if that's what you're looking for, that's what that is. So I don't have a lot to say about it, but you know, if you don't know who the first 4 caliphs of Mecca are, I guess you could read this book and find out. Next up, some books that I started actually in December. This is I Hope We Choose Love, A Trans Girl's Notes from the End of the World by Cheng Tom. She's the author of the poetry collection A Place Called No Homeland, which was, I think, one of my favorite poetry collections of the past few years. And she talks in this about basically intra-community conversations, some of which is from a general socially progressive angle, some of which is from a generally queer angle, some of which is specifically from a trans woman or trans feminine perspective. And I thought a lot of the conversations were quite powerful. She talks a lot about the idea, the harshness within communities that makes people afraid to progress conversations if they're afraid of getting something wrong. And I thought that was a really interesting conversation. Some of the conversations that she's having are community discussions that are so specific. Like there's one bit where she seems to be talking specifically about people who would have been in a particular scene in Montreal 10 years ago. Being outside of that, I don't have an opinion positively or negatively on anything like that because it is outside of my experience, and she's clearly talking to people within that experience primarily. Still, as a whole, I thought it was worth reading, and I think the more communities that you are familiar with or belong to that she is talking about these inner community discussions, the better this will probably be for you. But yeah, I thought this was well worth reading, and it is a quick read. Next up, I picked up the 4th volume of The Wildstorm. I talk about this all the time. I had read these in floppies, but I still wanted to pick this up because I do think this is the best superhero book I've read in years. This is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by John Davis Hunt. It is the reinvention of the Wildstorm universe, and what we have in the end is basically a rebuilding of the Authority. The characters are slightly different than they were in the original Wildstorm label. I think all the changes either work for the better or are essentially neutral. So there is honestly nothing about this that I think was mishandled. I just love this series. And if you like the less poppy style of superhero story, I definitely recommend this without reservation. Before and after I read that, I was also reading Pajtim Statovci's Crossing. This is an interesting novel. It is both more and less weird than the same author's My Cat Yugoslavia. There are fewer talking animals in this, but it is, I would say, even less traditionally structured. It's interesting, when I added this on Goodreads, I looked at some other people's reviews, and when you look at the reviews, there are about a third of people believe that there are 2 narrators in this, whereas I thought, and I would say 2/3 of the people felt that it was a single narrator. And I think the reason that there's this disagreement is that the main narrator kind of takes on the personality traits of people that he encounters. So one of those people is this boy who grew up in the flat next door, and because he takes on some of that boy's characteristics, it seems like we're getting the 2 of them in their adult lives jumping back and forth. But I think it's more that the one man grew up to take on the characteristics of not just his friend, but then other people as well as they go on. This jumps back and forth between time and place. The main character grew up in Albania during the end of the communist era. The earliest bits are set right around 1990, when there's this huge social change. It was the end of that whole state-required atheism bit. The main character is basically someone who decides, as he leaves Albania and goes first to Italy, then to Spain, then to the United States, then to Germany, that no element of identity should be fixed, that nationality is irrelevant, that gender is irrelevant, that sexuality is irrelevant. None of that matters. So he will present himself any way he needs to. So sometimes he will present himself as male, sometimes female. When he immigrates to Italy, he does it as an Albanian, but when he leaves Italy, he pretends to be Italian in Spain and then Spanish in the United States, Bosnian in Germany, Turkish, Finland, and the backstory changes depending on where he came from, the last place that he lived, but also the people that he meets, and he absorbs some of their stories into himself. So is he a person in flux, or is he just a compulsive liar? I saw a few people compare this to the main character in The Talented Mr. Ripley taking on somebody else's life. But he's not really taking on one person's life, he's taking on different bits of lives. So I thought this was really interesting, but it is odd, and I don't think it will be to everyone's taste. There is also a relatively graphic rape scene in here that I think will turn people off, but I thought this was really interesting and compelling. On the complete opposite side, when it comes to tone, I also read a middle grade novel. This is Roll With It by Jamie Sumner. This is about a 12-year-old girl who loves baking. She lives with her single mother in Nashville. Her grandfather, who's in Oklahoma, has Alzheimer's, and she and her mother go and move into her grandparents' trailer park home to look after the grandparents. And so there's a lot of talk about how best to support the grandparents in this situation. There's a lot of class discussion because she starts a new school and has to deal with the fact that she and her friends who she carpools with are all the trailer park kids, and that's all interesting. She's an avid baker, and so each chapter opens with her writing to either a magazine editor or to a famous cook or chef or baker about recipes that she's trying out, and all of that was quite charming. The first 25% of this, which is about their lives in Nashville, I thought was really weak. It was weirdly medical. It felt like it didn't need to be there. And the main character has CP and uses a wheelchair. And in the final 3/4 of this, I thought that was mostly dealt with in a way that was very naturalistic, because it wasn't really a focus, except in the sense that the school bus isn't accessible and there's discussion about whether she can get into things and the kind of conversations that would naturally pop up. But in the first quarter of this, I did find myself thinking, I bet this was written by the parent of somebody with CP, and indeed, in the back it says that. And I feel like you shouldn't feel that kind of external voice. I don't think it's ideal that I could tell that this was written by a parent, and I think that's a shame. So I thought that was too bad. But the final 3/4 of this were decent, and I like books that talk about food. So, as usual, I was also listening to an audiobook, although the weather has turned, which means I'm not listening to them as much because I only listen to them when I'm walking the dog, and I think this may have expired in the past couple of days. But I got about 3/4 of the way through it. And that was John Cleese's memoir, So Anyway. It is read by the author, which is brilliant because occasionally he laughs at bits and pieces, and it is a full memoir of his entire life. He talks about his parents during his childhood. He talks about things like when he finished his A-levels. It was the same year that the UK did away with mandatory service, so there was a double cohort of people going to university, so he ended up teaching for 2 years because he got into university, but they weren't going to take him for 2 years because they were taking these people who had been doing their military service first. So he talks, I mean, it's kind of delightful to hear about his teaching experiences because so many of those ended up becoming fodder for his comedy writing later. Hearing about how BBC television and radio worked in the 1960s, about how they lived as this kind of TV culture was changing, is all really brilliant stuff. It's less laugh out loud funny than some comedian memoirs are, but when the chuckles happen, they're genuine, and sometimes he laughs at his own memories as he's reading them to you, which I thought was additionally charming. So if you are a fan of John Cleese's, any of his properties that he's written, I think it's definitely worth reading or listening to because you do find out a lot of backstory and a lot of things that were based on actual experiences of his, and it is just great fun. And I wish I'd finished it because I'm pretty sure it's now returned itself to the library. I guess technically the first a couple of those things qualified during November for Nonfiction November and the Readathon, and these 3 would qualify for the queer lit readathon that was happening the first week of December as well. So yeah, so that was all fairly positive. If you read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. I think maybe I'll end this video instead of the usual dog video. I might add the bulletin board from the library because I felt like filming that yesterday and I don't know what I'm gonna do with that video if I don't put it on one of these. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.